D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Hey, Cortex fans. Welcome to the Primed by Cortex podcast. I'm your host, JT.
And I'm your co-host, Kerby. And today we're going to be talking about what is Cortex Prime. JT and I will go over what the branding itself says and its history, and we'll talk about how it generally works and go over in broad strokes the various sort of ingredients, as it were, that factor into Cortex Prime.
All right, well, let's dive into it then. So Cortex Prime is a role-playing game, and Cortex actually began with the iteration now called Cortex Classic, which came about through the Serenity role-playing game by Margaret Weis Productions in 2005. But then it expanded to include things like the Supernatural RPG, Battlestar Galactica, eventually leading us into a new iteration of Cortex Plus. Kerby, you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So Cortex Classic, as you were saying, covered a lot of those bases, and even back then it was already this kind of modifiable game. Cortex Plus took it further, and we started seeing some new changes to the Cortex system, and following with what Cortex Classic had been doing, Cortex Plus also landed several IPs, largely for TV shows and big-time IPs such as Marvel Heroics role-playing, Leverage, which is based off the Leverage TV show, Smallville, which is based off the Smallville show, as well as Firefly, which was my introduction personally into Cortex. And so all these different games have the same core concepts and ideas, even when they were using different sort of character builds and different angles on existing mechanics, which brings us to Cortex Prime.
Yeah, and Cortex Prime is the latest modern iteration of the Cortex rule set, and it's really designed sort of as a successor in a lot of ways to the previous iterations, in that it incorporates a lot of the different elements from both Cortex Classic and Cortex Plus, and sort of offers them to, puts those elements together in a modular way so that you can sort of choose which elements you want to have in a game and which work best for a particular setting that you want to do, and basically aims to be a generic system that you can use for a lot of different genres and settings. Right.
So although they are not presently being sold anywhere online, or they have been taken off they're not printing anymore. And essentially you can take Cortex Prime and remake all those games, or you can start priming your own settings, whether you're mixing genres or looking at modern television shows that you would love to turn into its own game system. Now, that's not to say that we're obviously just married to books, that this is a good system to prime various video games or book series that you might like, movies, etc.
But it definitely does work well for anything that you want to have a more cinematic type of tone. Like if you can imagine it through the lens of a camera, it should translate pretty well to Cortex Prime.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in this episode, we're going to be talking about how that sort of works, like what the underlying mechanic is for all of these different settings and genres that we're talking about.
So Cortex Prime, unlike some of the other popular games like Dungeons and Dragons or other D20 system games, doesn't actually use the D20. So you still have all the other dice from D4 to D12. And the most important thing to know is that you're going to be using these different dice and putting them together into a dice pool using a roll and keep system.
Right. And in terms of what dice you're using, basically All these different Cortex games can have different stats, unlike other toolbox systems such as Genesis or Savage Worlds, where, yeah, you can inject those with new skills and stuff. Sometimes a Cortex game doesn't actually use your conventional attributes or skills, and that's the kind of thing that is the kind of thing we will talk about in future episodes. But typically, you're putting a dice pool together, and the specific size of the die, whether it's a D4, D8, D12, whatever have you, basically measures how good you are at that thing. And so you have all these different dice at different sizes. You roll them together, and you're trying to keep 2 of them. And a lot of times that will be the highest total that you can get between the two results. Very basic math. You're just adding 2 dice together at no additional cost. But other times there might come occasions where you might not want the highest total. And we'll certainly talk about that. Maybe not this episode, but I think in future episodes.
Yeah, and I think it's important, actually, Kerby, to mention that the dice also don't always necessarily mean that those things are what you're best at, but it does for sure mean that it is what a character has the most influence within the story. So, if you've got a superpower rated at D12, then that means that superpower is going to be able to play a massive role in the narrative. Whereas if you had, like a D4 punch skill, then you're probably not going to be doing as much to change the way things are going with your punch.
Right. And it can be a little deceptive. A big pool obviously can obviously help improve your chances of success. And having bigger dice, it's generally better. But what the danger is between having like a big or small pool is when you roll ones. So basically, when you roll your dice pool here for the most basic rolls, you're keeping 2 dice, but you can also roll ones which are referred to as hitches. And hitches basically don't get qualified to count toward your total. And on top of that, your game moderator might actually activate that hitch and create what is called a complication for you.
Yeah, and I think it might be good actually to talk about sort of like the basic setup of a Cortex game with everything else stripped away. So basically what we're looking at is every character is going to have a trait, and a trait is just something that a character is good at doing, or that, plays a big role for them in the story. So a lot of times it could be something like, who are they? What do they do? So you could have, you could have heroic super powered mutant as a trait. And that would sort of be something that really defines your character. And it could really be anything depending on the genre and setting.
Yeah, in most Cortex games, whether it's an officially published game or something that your game moderator has cobbled together, are going to outline this. So you're not necessarily inventing these traits on the fly, although you can certainly have games that do that. You're generally going to have a few different traits. You're generally going to have a few different types of traits, actually. And so what we're largely going to be talking about in this episode is like the most basic character sheet that you might see in Cortex Prime. But that's not to say that you can't have more complex characters or more complex sheets by bringing in new traits that we're not going to really cover today, but we'll definitely mention.
So basically with your dice pool, you're going to just have a number of dice, and you can add in more depending on how many relevant traits that you have to a roll to represent sort of the different strengths that you have in order to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and it's kind of a little bit like a shopping list. So just like you have different sections in a grocery store, like produce section, cereal aisle, etc., you'll find that your character sheets are going to categorize these different traits into what are called trait sets. And so the most like traditional trait set that you can think of for most games outside of Cortex, like D&D or again, Savage Worlds or just any other game, right, is you're typically looking at attributes and skills, and which is an option to build a character sheet in Cortex. So you would be picking a die from your attribute, whichever one makes the most sense, and then you'd be picking a skill from the skill list, whichever makes more sense. But there's more to it. A very common trait are distinctions.
Yeah, and that those distinctions are kind of like the example I gave earlier, Kerby, which was like the superpowered mutant, which is sort of just a little phrase that describes something important about your character.
Yeah, and so for example here, if you are what's a good fake name that we can use?
Jane Default.
So if you are a superpowered mutant, as per your distinction, you can actually use that die from your distinction. And a lot of times distinctions are rated D8, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. And actually, let me preface this before I say that line a lot, is none the way that this hypothetical setup is geared for. It doesn't have to be that way. You can use different stats, different skills and stuff. But for our example, if you're trying to save a kitten who is falling from a very tall tree, Jane Defaults might grab their die from their superpowered mutant distinction. They might grab another die from their attributes. In this case, let's just say there's a generic physical attribute, physical, social, mental. And so they grab the physical attribute that's the most relevant to what they're doing. They're racing across the field to go save that kitten. And then if we assume that, like, I don't know, athletics is a skill on this hypothetical character sheet, they might use athletics as they kind of leap and bound over rocks and falling over trees and such. And so now they have this dice pool consisting of 3 of their traits, and they're going to roll it, and they're going to pick usually their 2 highest ones, highest results.
Right, but you can totally choose not to if you wanted. It's kind of up to you because there are other things that'll come into play.
Yeah, the reason why you might not want to pick your highest results is due to the fact that when you're making rolls, sometimes it matters how effective you are at a thing. And so you pick a 3rd die to be your effect die. And sometimes it's more important to have a big effect on the situation than it is to have the highest total necessarily. But we're just going over basics right now. We're figuring out how Jane Default is going to save that kitten. But how do you know if you're actually successful?
Right. So by the default rules, any character who's rolling for a task is going to be up against a difficulty pool. And basically it's constructed in a very similar way to the way that a player character will do theirs. Usually it's rolled by the game moderator, and they're basically rolling and keeping 2 dice also. And whatever the difficulty pool ends up being will tell you the number that you need to beat.
Yep. And unlike a lot of systems, you have to beat that target number. And you're going to know what the target number is. This opposition pool is not rolled in secret. And again, like JT was alluding to, that's just the kind of vanilla way at approaching gameplay. We can, of course, change a lot of different factors to include what traits are available to play. We can also talk about how you can, if you don't like the idea of doing opposed rolls because maybe you think it slows down the game, you can actually nix that out and it will work just fine. The game moderator can just choose a number. And all these different things get factored into what the Cortex Prime system calls mods.
Right. Mods are just different variations to the rules or optional things that you can add in or take away in order to change the way that the game is played. And usually you do that in order to change like the tone of a setting or to include certain elements that might be in one setting but not another, and to make sure that it plays the way you want it to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if there's any like particular thing you maybe didn't like about that example, like maybe you don't like the idea of just having a physical stat, it should be broken out to dexterity and strength and constitution or whatever, you can absolutely have that in your game. And you can also modify the way the game plays by adopting some of these mods. And so this is by design. This is why it's really called This is why the system refers to itself as being modular. Like it's a toolbox system, and it's a system that actually gives you different tools to use for your specific game.
Exactly. And the last element that I think probably would be good to cover, Kerby, is a mechanic that is integral to many Cortex games, but not necessarily all. And you can certainly take it out if you don't like it, but that is the plot point.
Yeah, the plot point is this sort of meta currency that gets spent at the table. You can take it out or substitute it. It would be rough without changing other stuff. And, that's maybe an episode that we can talk about in the future for JT. But basically, plot points are a way to sort of divvy out narrative power, both between the game moderator and the player character.
So plot points can be used in a few ways, and we're not going to cover all of them now because that is sort of beyond the scope of this episode. But one of the ways that you could use it would be to include more than 2 dice in your total that you roll. So if you didn't meet if you didn't beat the difficulty that you're trying to beat, maybe you want to spend a plot point and add in a 3rd die that'll get you over that number.
Yeah, there's a number of things you could be doing before or after a die roll has occurred to try to better your chances. And so, like JT said, we're not going to cover every single base, but in a hypothetical game where JT is just running this completely dreadful game where he's just tossing kittens out of trees for some reason, let's say JT rolls and let's say JT rolls the opposition and managed to roll a whopping 14, which is actually a pretty meaty difficulty to put yourself against, especially when you're only rolling 3 dice. And let's say Jane defaults rolls, because usually in such a test, the opposition pool is rolled before the player character. Jane default rolls a 12, and that's keeping her 2 highest defaults. That's keeping her 2 highest results, which was, let's just say, both 6s. And so the 3rd die, which is not being used right now, this situation doesn't really need an effect die, is a 4. And if she was allowed to include that into her dice total, she would be successful. And, she has spare plot points. She decides to spend a plot point and add that 3rd die toward the total and bring her up and over 14, and she successfully saves the kitten. But there are other things we could be doing with that plot point.
Yeah, one other thing that I could imagine you could do it with a plot point in that situation would be maybe Jane Default activates one of her powers using a special effect, and maybe that lets her add in an additional die into the pool so that she has a higher chance of rolling higher than that difficulty number.
Another thing, and this is something I personally really like, especially when I was first learning the game, is Jane Default could be spending a plot point to add a die to the dice pool before even rolling, and this is used to create what are called assets. And assets are literally anything that reflects the conditions, circumstances, or they could be objects in the environment. They could be the environment themselves. Anything that's going to have a dramatic effect toward the success of a character. And so these assets come into play. They're temporary. They typically last a scene. And, there's a little bit of nuance there as to making it better or making it last longer. But in our situation, Jane Default could be talking about maybe we established this park where this kitten is falling out of the tree as being a golf course. And so rather than just relying on her super mutant speed, maybe Jane Default spends a plot point to turn a nearby golf cart into an asset that she can use to get herself there faster. And so that would be added to her pool before she rolls as an extra die, improving her chances at being successful.
Right. And I think that's basically anything a new player to Cortex would have to really know in order to start playing. I think it's pretty straightforward and simple, wouldn't you say, Kerby?
I would say so. And the Cortex Prime handbook definitely adds a more streamlined way than we described it as to visualizing what's going on. Jane Default is a character in the Cortex handbook that you can follow in various examples and try to wrap your head around the game before you get into it. But that's a very rough cut of what it looks like to play a Cortex Prime situation out.
So now that our listeners know a little bit more about the system, why don't we talk a little bit about what sort of games and other things we can expect from the Cortex Prime line?
Right. So at the time of this recording, the Cortex Prime handbook has been released, and that's basically going to cover the various rules, not just what we talked about, but even the more nuanced rules that you can choose to introduce into your game. And that handbook also comes with 3 mini settings that you can just pick up and run for your players. It's otherwise sort of a handbook as to how to prime your own games. But for our dear listeners who might find that a little bit daunting, especially since, they're still trying to figure out they like the game, there are a couple of products that are releasing next year.
Yes, and one of them that I think is really cool is Legends of Grayskull, which basically is all about the Masters of the Universe. So things like He-Man and She-Ra.
Yeah, and that's going to cover a multiverse situation. So you can totally have the old school He-Man situation going on, or you can lean into more of the new school stuff, or whatever they're apparently doing with the miniseries that they're releasing on, I think, Netflix next year. And by them, I mean Netflix in general, not fandom, which would be wild. But they have Legends of Grayskull. They also have Tales from Exadia, which is based off the Dragon Prince, which is also another Netflix show.
Yeah, and then if you were just interested in doing games that maybe aren't tied to an existing IP, but you don't want to have to do the work of creating your own setting, they're also going to be releasing a few different volumes of Prime Spotlights, which are basically, setting in game books made for unique Cortex creator settings.
Yeah, and I think that's around 22, 24 games that they're going to be releasing, varying in how well they're going to be fleshed out. And those are all going to be available in the future. We don't have dates, but that actually brings us to why we're even here, the Creator Studio, which JT, I don't know if you want to talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so the Creator Studio is going to be a platform that is actually run by Fandom that owns the rights to Cortex Prime. And basically what it's going to do is allow you and others to release your own games or settings and other other publications that are based on and using the Cortex system. So if you've ever dreamed about becoming a game designer and maybe even publishing your own setting or anything else like that, and you like Cortex, you can go ahead and you can submit your game there using the Cortex system, and you would be able to have people see it and even pay for it, and hopefully get people playing it all around the world.
Yeah, and it's also important to note that this is where you're going to be able to get digital products, is from Fandom's Cortex Creative site. Now, you can go to cortexrpg.com, and at the time of this recording, they haven't released their digital tools, which they are working on. It's going to allow you to build character sheets for your settings, and I believe it should be allowing you to do dice rolls as well. But it's also where you're going to find digital purchases for PDFs and stuff. It won't be sold anywhere else, to the best of my knowledge. In terms of hard copy stuff, it sounds like that kind of thing is still going to be sold at your local game shop. I know a lot of the backers have gotten theirs already, and a lot of people have been placing orders as we speak to game shops as they started coming in. So at the time of this recording, the digital copies are not being sold yet. By the time we publish this, hopefully they will be. They talked about a short turnaround time, but as is, you could be finding Cortex in other games and game shops as well.
But if you're really excited about Cortex and just want to see how it plays, there's actually a great video, which we can include in the show notes. And Cam Banks actually ran Legends of Grayskull for a few celebrities, including Felicia Day.
Yeah, and I think at least one of those celebrities is actually going to be in that miniseries that they're doing.
Yeah. So, we'll put those in the show notes, and then you can actually watch a Cortex game in practice and basically see all the different elements that Kerby and I have been talking about this episode in play.
Yeah, but we're not going to just be doing system discussions, which that is going to probably make up a good chunk of our content, is talking about these specific ingredients and mods in Cortex and how they might apply to your setting or genre or whatever your project is. But we're going to be covering other segments.
Yeah. For example, we actually have some interviews in the pipeline already.
Yeah, so we have a handful of interviews. We're going to be talking to creators, both big and small. And we also plan on taking listener questions.
Yes, we do, because we want to hear what you want to know about the Cortex system and any, feedback or ideas that you might have. We also are planning on hopefully doing some actual plays and scenarios on the podcast, which I think is going to be a lot of fun for people to see a Cortex game in action from us.
Yeah, so we'll do actual plays. We are also, and this is another thing that listeners can submit in our suggestions for, we're also planning on doing segments where we just kind of prime a existing IP or mash up some IPs and or genres with how JT and I might do it if we were running it for our game or for the podcast, which, to be clear, there's, in my opinion, no single way to prime a given IP. I feel like you could take a given show or book series and prime it any manner of ways. So we're certainly not the authorities on, this is how a Care Bears RPG is supposed to look like. So where can people find us and send us these crazy suggestions, questions, and ideas that they might have?
Yeah, so the best way to get in contact with us is probably through email, which is going to be PBC Podcasts. That's primed by Cortex Podcast, but PBC Podcast at d20radio.com, which is our affiliate network. And then we also have a Facebook page if you're a Facebook user and you wanted to get in touch with us there and keep track of, the different content and discussions going on there. And we also have a Twitter, which is at Primed by Cortex. And so, get us your questions, give us feedback. We would absolutely love if you would subscribe and rate our show on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. Any feedback is always helpful for us, both for improving our show and also letting other people know about the show and getting the word out there.
Yeah. And that's our show, Prime by Cortex. We hope you'll tune in next time when we drop some more system discussions, and we hope to get some interviews out to y'all soon. We have a nice, tidy little backlog for that, and we'll see you around.
See ya.